The autumn sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street in Mesa, Arizona, where Harold Harry Richardson had lived peacefully for the past 15 years. At 72 years old, Harry maintained the same disciplined routine he had followed during his 28 years serving in the United States Marine Corps. Every morning at 0600 hours, he would rise, make his bed with military precision, brew a single cup of black coffee, and step onto his front porch to watch the neighborhood wake up. Harry's weathered hands still bore the calluses of countless hours spent maintaining military equipment, and his steel-gray eyes carried the quiet confidence of a man who had served his country with honor in Vietnam, Grenada, and the First Gulf War. His neighbors knew him as the friendly grandfather who helped fix broken sprinkler systems, volunteered at the local food bank, and never missed his grandson's baseball games. What they didn't know was that Harry Richardson had been awarded 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and had led his men through some of the most dangerous missions the Marine Corps had ever undertaken. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Harry noticed something unusual as he sipped his coffee. Mrs. Chun from next door was standing in her driveway, looking distressed as she spoke on her cell phone. Her hands were shaking, and she kept glancing toward the street with obvious fear. Harry set down his coffee mug and walked over to the property line that separated their homes. "Everything all right, Mrs. Chun?" Harry asked, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded respect for Marines half his age. Mrs. Chun looked up with relief evident in her expression. "Oh, Harry, thank goodness you're here. Someone broke into my garage last night and stole my husband's tools. The police are on their way, but I'm scared they might come back." Harry nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Chun and her husband were good neighbors who had moved in 5 years ago from Taiwan. Mr. Chun worked long hours at a local engineering firm, and Mrs. Chun taught piano lessons from their home. They were quiet, respectful people who always waved when they saw Harry working in his garden. "Did you see anything suspicious last night?" Harry asked, his trained eyes automatically scanning the area for signs of forced entry or other evidence. Mrs. Chun shook her head. "I heard some noise around midnight, but I thought it was just cats fighting in the alley. This morning when I went to get my car, I saw the garage door was slightly open and all of David's expensive tools were gone." Harry could see the clear marks where someone had pried open the garage door. The scratches in the metal were fresh, and there were muddy footprints leading from the garage toward the back alley. His military training automatically kicked in as he began mentally cataloging details that might be useful for the investigating officers. 20 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of Mrs. Chen's house. Harry watched from his porch as 4 officers got out of their vehicles. 3 of them appeared to be relatively young, probably in their late 20s or early 30s. The 4th officer was older, maybe in his mid-40s, with the thick build of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the field. Harry observed as Mrs. Chen approached the officers and began explaining what had happened. From his position on the porch, he could hear most of the conversation. Mrs. Chen's English was excellent, but she spoke with a slight accent that seemed to frustrate the older officer, who kept interrupting her and asking her to repeat herself. After about 10 minutes, one of the younger officers began taking photographs of the garage, while another started interviewing Mrs. Chen more thoroughly. The 3rd officer was examining the footprints Harry had noticed earlier. Everything seemed to be proceeding normally until the older officer began asking Mrs. Chen questions that struck Harry as inappropriate and potentially discriminatory. "How long have you been in this country?" the officer asked, his tone carrying an edge that made Harry's jaw tighten. 15 years, Mrs. Chen replied politely. "My husband and I are both American citizens." "Do you have any documentation of ownership for these tools that were supposedly stolen?" the officer continued, emphasizing the word supposedly in a way that clearly implied doubt. Harry felt his blood pressure rising. He had dealt with enough bureaucrats and petty officials during his military career to recognize someone abusing their authority. Mrs. Chun was being treated like a suspect rather than a victim, and it was clear that her ethnicity was playing a role in the officer's attitude. The situation escalated when the older officer began suggesting that Mrs. Chun might have filed a false police report for insurance purposes. Harry watched as Mrs. Chin's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She was a proud woman who had never asked for anything from anyone, and the implication that she was lying was deeply offensive to her. Harry stood up from his porch chair and walked toward the group. He had no intention of interfering with a police investigation, but he also couldn't stand by and watch a good neighbor be mistreated by someone who was supposed to be serving and protecting the community. "Excuse me, officer," Harry said in his calm, measured voice as he approached the group. "I'm Harold Richardson, Mrs. Chen's neighbor. I was wondering if I could provide any information that might be helpful to your investigation." The older officer turned toward Harry with obvious irritation. "Sir, please step back. This is an active police investigation, and we don't need any interference from civilians." Harry stopped walking, but didn't step back. "I understand that, officer. I'm simply offering to provide any relevant information I might have observed. I'm a retired Marine, and I've been trained in observation and evidence preservation." "I don't care if you're a retired general," the officer snapped. "I need you to return to your property, and let us do our job." The younger officers looked uncomfortable with their colleague's aggressive tone, but none of them spoke up. Harry could sense the tension in the group, and his decades of experience reading people told him that this situation was heading in a dangerous direction. "I respect your authority, officer," Harry said, maintaining his calm demeanor. "I'm simply trying to be a good neighbor and a helpful citizen. If you don't need my assistance, I'll be happy to return to my home." But as Harry turned to leave, he heard the older officer make a comment under his breath about neighborhood busybodies and old men who watch too much TV. The comment was clearly intended for Harry to hear, and it was designed to humiliate him in front of Mrs. Chun and the other officers. Harry stopped walking and turned back around. In his 72 years, he had faced enemy fire, buried fallen comrades, and endured hardships that most people couldn't imagine. He had earned the right to be treated with basic respect, especially by someone whose salary was paid by taxpayers like himself. "Officer," Harry said, his voice still calm, but now carrying a steel edge that his former Marines would have recognized immediately. "I've served this country for 28 years in the United States Marine Corps. I've earned the right to offer assistance when I see a neighbor in need. If you don't want my help, that's fine, but there's no need to be disrespectful." The older officer's face turned red with anger. "Are you threatening me, old man?" "I'm not threatening anyone," Harry replied. "I'm simply asking to be treated with the same respect I show to you." What happened next would be captured on the body cameras worn by all four officers, though the footage wouldn't be reviewed until much later. The older officer, whose name tag read Martinez, stepped closer to Harry in what any reasonable person would interpret as an intimidating gesture. "I think you need to learn some respect for law enforcement," Officer Martinez said, his hand moving toward the equipment on his belt. Harry remained perfectly still, his hands visible at his sides, his posture non-threatening. He had been in enough dangerous situations to know that sudden movements could escalate conflicts, and he had no desire to make the situation worse. But he also wasn't going to be bullied by someone who was clearly abusing their authority. The three younger officers were now watching the interaction with obvious concern. Mrs. Chun had stepped back toward her garage, her eyes wide with worry. The peaceful suburban morning had suddenly turned into something that none of them had expected. Harry maintained eye contact with Officer Martinez, neither backing down nor escalating the confrontation. It was a skill he had learned during his military career, how to stand firm without being provocative. But Officer Martinez seemed to interpret Harry's calm confidence as defiance. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Martinez ordered suddenly. Harry blinked in surprise. "Officer, I haven't committed any crime. I'm standing on a public sidewalk, and I haven't made any threatening gestures or statements." "You're interfering with a police investigation," Martinez replied, though everyone present knew that Harry had done nothing more than offer to help and asked to be treated with respect. One of the younger officers, whose name tag read Johnson, stepped forward. "Sarge, Maybe we should just take Mr. Richardson's statement and move on. He seems like he's trying to be helpful. Martinez whirled around to face Officer Johnson. Did I ask for your opinion, rookie? This old man needs to learn that when a police officer gives an order, you follow it without question. Harry realized that the situation had moved beyond anything resembling normal police procedure. Officer Martinez seemed to be using Harry as an opportunity to demonstrate his authority to the younger officers, and Harry had somehow become a pawn in whatever internal dynamics were playing out within this particular police unit. The neighborhood had begun to take notice of the commotion. Harry could see curtains moving in several nearby houses, and he knew that his neighbors were watching to see how this unusual situation would unfold. Some of them might even be recording the incident on their cell phones, though Harry was too focused on Officer Martinez to pay much attention to the growing audience. Mrs. Chun spoke up from her position near the garage. Officer Martinez, Mr. Richardson is a good man. He helps everyone in the neighborhood. He's not causing any trouble. Martinez turned toward Mrs. Chun with obvious anger. Ma'am, I need you to stay out of this as well. You're both interfering with my investigation. Harry felt a surge of protective anger toward Mrs. Chun. She had done nothing wrong, and now she was being intimidated for trying to speak up for a neighbor. The whole situation had become completely absurd, but Harry knew that arguing further would only make things worse. Officer Martinez, Harry said quietly, I'll be happy to return to my property if that's what you need. I apologize if I've somehow interfered with your investigation. But Martinez had apparently decided that Harry needed to be taught a lesson. It's too late for that, old man. You've already shown disrespect for law enforcement, and that's something I take very seriously. The other three officers were now clearly uncomfortable with the direction their supervisor was taking the encounter. Officer Johnson looked like he wanted to say something, but military-style hierarchy apparently prevented him from challenging Martinez directly. Harry remained calm, but his mind was racing through his options. He could comply with whatever Martinez demanded and hope that the situation would de-escalate, or he could continue to assert his rights as a citizen and risk further confrontation. Neither option seemed particularly appealing, but Harry had not spent nearly 3 decades in the Marine Corps to be intimidated by a bully with a badge. Officer Martinez reached for his radio and called for backup, claiming he had an uncooperative subject who was interfering with an investigation. Harry listened to this description with growing disbelief. In his entire life, he had never been in trouble with law enforcement. His military record was spotless. He had never even received a speeding ticket, and he had spent countless hours volunteering with organizations that supported police officers and their families. Within 5 minutes, 2 additional police cruisers arrived on the scene. Harry watched as 6 officers now surrounded him on what had been a peaceful Tuesday morning. Mrs. Chun had retreated to her front porch, her face pale with worry. Several neighbors had come outside to see what was happening, and Harry could hear whispered conversations as people tried to understand why their respected neighbor was being treated like a dangerous criminal. Officer Martinez approached Harry with handcuffs in his hand. Sir, you're under arrest for interfering with a police investigation. Harry kept his hands visible and spoke in the same calm tone he had maintained throughout the encounter. Officer, I respectfully disagree with your assessment. I offered to provide information. I asked to be treated with respect, and I agreed to return to my property when you requested it. I haven't interfered with anything. Don't tell me how to do my job, Martinez snapped. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Harry had reached a decision point. He could submit to what he believed was an unlawful arrest and hope to sort things out later, or he could continue to assert his constitutional rights. His military training had taught him about the importance of following lawful orders, but it had also taught him about the duty to resist unlawful commands. Officer Martinez, I'm going to need you to explain what specific law I violated, Harry said. As a citizen and a military veteran, I have certain rights that I'm not willing to give up without understanding why they're being taken away. The statement was delivered in Harry's characteristic calm tone, but it apparently pushed Martinez over the edge. You want to do this the hard way? Fine. We'll do it the hard way. What happened next shocked everyone who witnessed it, including the 5 other officers on the scene. Without any further warning, Officer Martinez drew his taser and pointed it directly at Harry's chest. "Get on the ground now," Martinez shouted, his voice carrying a level of aggression that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. Harry remained standing, but his posture was completely non-threatening. His hands were still visible at his sides, and he hadn't made any sudden movements. "Officer, I'm a 72-year-old man with a heart condition. Is it really necessary to use a weapon against me?" The mention of Harry's heart condition was not an exaggeration. He had undergone bypass surgery 3 years earlier and took medication to manage a regular heartbeat. His doctors had warned him about avoiding excessive stress and physical shock to his system. A taser deployment could potentially cause serious cardiac complications for someone in Harry's condition. Several neighbors shouted warnings to Officer Martinez about Harry's health issues. Mrs. Chin called out from her porch, "He has a bad heart. Please don't hurt him." But Martinez seemed beyond reasoning at this point. "I said get on the ground." Harry slowly began to lower himself toward the sidewalk, his 72-year-old knees protesting as he attempted to comply with the command. But Martinez apparently didn't think Harry was moving fast enough. The taser deployment was captured on multiple body cameras and cell phone recordings from neighbors. The 50,000 volts sent Harry crashing to the concrete sidewalk, his body convulsing uncontrollably as the electrical current coursed through his system. For 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, Harry was completely helpless as his muscles contracted and his nervous system was overwhelmed by artificial electrical signals. Mrs. Chun screamed from her porch. Several neighbors shouted at the officers to stop. Even the 5 other policemen looked stunned by Martinez's decision to use the taser against an elderly man who posed no physical threat to anyone. When the electrical cycle ended, Harry lay motionless on the sidewalk. His face was gray, and he was breathing in short, shallow gasps. Officer Johnson immediately called for an ambulance, recognizing that a man of Harry's age and medical condition might be experiencing a cardiac emergency. "Jesus Christ, Sarge," Officer Johnson said to Martinez, "what the hell did you just do?" Martinez seemed to realize that he had made a serious error in judgment, but his response was to double down on his actions rather than show any concern for Harry's welfare. He was resisting arrest. "I used appropriate force for a non-compliant subject." But everyone who had witnessed the incident knew that Harry had been in the process of complying with Martinez's commands when the taser was deployed. The use of force had been neither necessary nor appropriate, and it had potentially endangered the life of an elderly veteran who had done nothing more than try to help a neighbor. Harry remained on the ground, semi-conscious and struggling to breathe normally. His chest felt like it was being crushed, and he could feel his heart racing in an irregular pattern that scared him more than enemy fire ever had. In Vietnam, he had been wounded by shrapnel and had once spent 3 days behind enemy lines with a dislocated shoulder. But he had never felt as vulnerable as he did lying on that sidewalk, wondering if his heart was going to be able to handle the stress that had just been inflicted on his system. Mrs. Chun approached the group of officers, tears streaming down her face. You didn't need to hurt him. He's a good man. He was trying to help me." Officer Martinez turned on Mrs. Chun with renewed anger. "Ma'am, if you don't return to your property immediately, you're going to be arrested as well." But the other officers were no longer following Martinez's lead. Officer Johnson knelt down beside Harry and began checking his pulse and respiration. "Sir, can you hear me? We've got an ambulance on the way." Harry managed to nod slightly, though speaking required more effort than he could manage at the moment. His vision was still blurry from the electrical shock, and he felt nauseated and disoriented. The pain in his chest was getting worse rather than better, which he knew was not a good sign given his cardiac history. Another officer, whose name tag read Williams, stood up and faced Martinez directly. "Sarge, we need to start thinking about how we're going to explain this. That man didn't pose any threat to anyone, and you tossed him for no reason." Martinez's face was red with anger, but Harry could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. He was interfering with our investigation and refusing to follow lawful orders. He was trying to comply when you tossed him, Officer Williams replied. And offering to provide information isn't interference. It's cooperation. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension as the ambulance arrived, followed closely by a fire department rescue unit. The paramedics immediately took charge of Harry's care, checking his vital signs and preparing him for transport to the hospital. "Sir, I'm going to need you to tell me about any medical conditions you have," the lead paramedic said as he attached monitoring equipment to Harry's chest. Harry managed to speak, though his voice was weak and raspy. "Heart bypass 3 years ago. Taking medication for irregular heartbeat. Chest feels tight, hard to breathe." The paramedic's expression grew more serious as he reviewed the readings on his equipment. Harry's heart rate was dangerously elevated and irregular, and his blood pressure was showing signs of distress. The electrical shock from the taser had clearly affected his already compromised cardiovascular system. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," the paramedic announced. "This man is having cardiac complications." As the medical team prepared to load Harry onto a stretcher, he managed to catch Mrs. Chen's eye. Despite his condition, he was more worried about her than himself. The officers still hadn't properly investigated her burglary, and she was now traumatized by watching her neighbor being brutalized by the people who were supposed to protect her. "Mrs. Chun," Harry whispered as the paramedics lifted the stretcher, "call my daughter Sarah. Number's on the refrigerator. Tell her what happened." Mrs. Chun nodded through her tears. "I will, Harry. Don't worry about anything. Just get better." Officer Martinez watched the ambulance drive away with Harry inside, and for the first time, he seemed to grasp the potential consequences of his actions. Tasing an elderly veteran for no legitimate reason was likely to generate significant attention from the media, internal affairs investigators, and the veteran community. Martinez had just created a public relations nightmare for his department and potentially ended his own career. Officer Johnson approached Martinez with barely contained anger. "Sarge, I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. That man was completely cooperative, and you nearly killed him." "Nobody asked for your opinion, Johnson," Martinez replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Officer Williams joined the confrontation. "Actually, Sarge, I think you're going to be getting a lot of people's opinions about this. That whole thing was recorded on our body cameras, and half the neighborhood was filming it on their phones." The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in for Martinez. In the age of social media and viral videos, police misconduct could spread around the world in a matter of hours. The image of a 72-year-old veteran being tossed for trying to help his neighbor was exactly the kind of story that would generate massive public outrage. Mrs. Chun had gone inside her house to call Harry's daughter, but she returned quickly with a phone in her hand. "I called Sarah Richardson. She's on her way to the hospital. I also called my husband, and he's coming home from work. He's going to want to know why you hurt our neighbor." Martinez realized that the situation was spiraling completely out of his control. What should have been a routine burglary investigation had turned into a potential career-ending incident of police brutality. And the worst part was that it had been completely unnecessary. Harry Richardson had posed no threat to anyone, and his only crime had been trying to be a helpful neighbor. The other officers on the scene were already distancing themselves from Martinez's actions. They continued with the burglary investigation, but their focus was clearly on documenting what had happened to Harry rather than supporting their supervisor's version of events. Officer Johnson took detailed photographs of the exact spot where Harry had been lying when the taser was deployed. The concrete showed scrape marks from where Harry's face had hit the sidewalk, and there were small spots of blood where he had been injured in the fall. "Williams, you need to make sure all the body camera footage from this incident gets preserved exactly as it is," Johnson said. "No editing, no deletion, no mysterious technical problems. This whole thing is going to be investigated, and we need to make sure the truth comes out." Officer Williams nodded grimly. "Already done. I've also requested that the footage be copied and stored separately from our normal system. Martinez isn't going to be able to make this disappear." As the crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed, several of them approached the remaining officers to provide witness statements about what they had observed. Their accounts were consistent. Harry Richardson had been polite, cooperative, and non-threatening throughout the entire encounter. Officer Martinez had escalated the situation for no apparent reason and had used excessive force against an elderly man who posed no danger to anyone. Mrs. Chin finished her statement and returned to her house, but not before making it clear that she intended to file formal complaints about Martinez's conduct. Mr. Richardson is like a grandfather to this whole neighborhood. What you did to him was wrong, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it. Meanwhile, at Mesa General Hospital, Harry was undergoing emergency cardiac evaluation in the ER. His daughter Sarah had arrived and was pacing the waiting room, trying to understand how her father had gone from drinking morning coffee on his porch to lying in a hospital bed with heart complications. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, had treated taser injuries before, but she was particularly concerned about Harry's case due to his age and medical history. The electrical shock had triggered an episode of atrial fibrillation, and his heart was struggling to return to a normal rhythm. Mr. Richardson, Dr. Gonzalez said as she reviewed his test results, "You're going to need to stay here for observation. The electrical shock has affected your heart rhythm, and we need to monitor you closely for the next several hours." Harry nodded weakly. Despite the medication they had given him for pain and anxiety, he was still feeling the effects of the traumatic experience. But more than his physical discomfort, he was troubled by the broader implications of what had happened. In all his years of military service, Harry had worked alongside law enforcement officers in various capacities, and he had always had tremendous respect for the difficult and dangerous job they performed. But what had happened that morning represented everything that was wrong with policing when power was abused and citizens were treated as enemies rather than as the people officers were sworn to serve and protect. Sarah Richardson sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands shaking as she tried to process what Mrs. Chun had told her over the phone. Her father, a decorated Marine Corps veteran who had never been in trouble with the law in his entire life, was lying in an emergency room because a police officer had tossed him for trying to help a neighbor. It seemed impossible to believe, but the evidence was overwhelming. As a family law attorney who had practiced in Arizona for 15 years, Sarah understood the legal system better than most people. She knew that police officers had broad authority to maintain order and protect public safety, but she also knew that authority had limits. What had happened to her father appeared to be a clear case of excessive force and civil rights violations. Dr. Gonzalez emerged from the treatment area and approached Sarah with a clipboard full of test results. "Ms. Richardson, your father is stable, but I need to discuss his condition with you. The electrical shock from the taser has triggered an irregular heart rhythm called atrial fibrillation. Given his history of heart disease, this is a serious concern." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Is he going to be okay?" "We're doing everything we can to get his heart rhythm back to normal," Dr. Gonzalez explained. "But at his age and with his medical history, any kind of electrical shock to the system can have serious consequences. We'll need to keep him here for at least 24 hours for monitoring." "Can I see him?" Sarah asked. Dr. Gonzalez nodded. "He's been asking for you. But I should warn you that he's pretty shaken up by what happened. This wasn't just a physical trauma for him. It was emotional and psychological as well." Sarah found her father lying in a hospital bed, connected to various monitoring devices that tracked his heart rhythm and vital signs. Despite his age and the ordeal he had been through, Harry's eyes were clear and alert when she walked into the room. "Dad, how are you feeling?" Sarah asked, taking his hand gently. Harry managed a weak smile. "I've been better, sweetheart, but I'm more worried about what this says about our community than I am about my own condition." Sarah wasn't surprised by her father's response. Even lying in a hospital bed, he was thinking about the bigger picture rather than his own suffering. It was typical of the man who had spent his life serving others, first in the military and then as a volunteer in his community. "Dad, we need to talk about what happened. I'm going to want to pursue legal action against the officer who did this to you." Harry nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that too. Not for revenge, but because if this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. Mrs. Chen was being treated badly too, and she didn't deserve that. As they talked, Sarah's phone began buzzing with text messages and phone calls. Word about the incident was already spreading through the community, and local news outlets had picked up the story. The video footage from neighbors' cell phones was being shared on social media, and the image of a 72-year-old veteran being tossed on his own street was generating exactly the kind of outrage that Officer Martinez had feared. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Chief Robert Hayes was dealing with the worst public relations crisis of his 25-year career. The body camera footage from the incident had been reviewed, and it clearly showed that Martinez had used excessive force against a cooperative elderly man. Internal affairs investigators were already preparing their report, and Hayes knew that the department would be facing lawsuits, federal investigations, and intense media scrutiny. Officer Johnson had requested a meeting with Chief Hayes, and he was shown into the chief's office along with Officer Williams. Both men looked grim as they sat down across from their commanding officer. "Chief, we need to talk about what happened this morning with Sergeant Martinez," Johnson began. "What he did out there was completely out of line, and Williams and I want to make sure our positions are clear before this thing gets any bigger." Chief Hayes leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "I've already reviewed the body camera footage. Tell me in your own words what you saw." Officer Williams spoke first. "Chief, Mr. Richardson was completely cooperative throughout the entire encounter. He offered to provide information about a burglary at his neighbor's house. Martinez got aggressive with him for no reason, and then Martinez tossed him while he was trying to comply with commands. It was completely unnecessary use of force." Officer Johnson nodded in agreement. "Chief, I've worked with Martinez for 3 years, and he's been getting more aggressive lately. This morning he was treating Mrs. Chun poorly too, asking inappropriate questions about her citizenship status, and implying that she was lying about the burglary. The whole thing was unprofessional from start to finish." Chief Hayes made notes as the officer spoke. "Are you both willing to testify to that in an internal investigation?" "Absolutely," both officers replied simultaneously. "What about the other officers who were on scene?" "They'll back us up," Williams said. "Nobody who was there thinks Martinez's actions were justified. The man was 72 years old and had a heart condition. Martinez knew that, and he tossed him anyway." Chief Hayes dismissed the officers and immediately called the department's legal counsel. The city was going to face significant liability for Martinez's actions, and Hayes needed to understand exactly how much trouble they were in. The legal analysis was devastating. The use of force against Harry Richardson appeared to violate clearly established constitutional rights, which meant that the city could be held liable for substantial damages. Worse, the incident had been captured on video from multiple angles, so there would be no disputing what had happened. Within 3 hours of the incident, the first news crew arrived at Mesa General Hospital. Sarah Richardson had decided to speak with the media, both to tell her father's story and to make sure that similar incidents didn't happen to other families. "My father is a 72-year-old Marine Corps veteran who has served his community faithfully for his entire adult life," Sarah told the reporter. "This morning he tried to help a neighbor who had been the victim of a burglary, and for that act of kindness, he was tossed by a police officer and is now lying in a hospital bed with heart complications." The news story aired on the evening broadcast and was immediately picked up by national networks. The video footage of Harry being tossed was played repeatedly, and veteran advocacy groups began issuing statements condemning the police department's actions. The American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and Marine Corps League all issued press releases calling for a full investigation of the incident and accountability for the officer responsible. The story was particularly resonant because it involved a decorated combat veteran being brutalized by the very people who were supposed to protect and serve the community. As the story spread across social media, details about Harry's military service began to emerge. Fellow Marines who had served with him shared stories about his courage under fire and his dedication to his men. The picture that emerged was of a man who had spent his life serving others and who had never been anything but a model citizen. Mrs. Chen also spoke with reporters, providing additional context about Harry's character and the events that had led up to the confrontation. "Mr. Richardson is like a grandfather to everyone in our neighborhood," she said. "He helps elderly neighbors with their yard work. He volunteers at the food bank, and he's never caused any trouble for anyone. What happened to him was wrong, and Officer Martinez should be held accountable." By evening, the police department was receiving hundreds of phone calls from angry citizens demanding Martinez's termination. The department's social media accounts were flooded with comments from veterans and community members who were outraged by the incident. Chief Hayes held an emergency press conference at 8 p.m., flanked by the mayor and the city attorney. The chief's statement was carefully crafted to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation without admitting legal liability. "The Mesa Police Department takes all allegations of misconduct seriously," Hayes said. "We are conducting a thorough internal investigation of this morning's incident, and we are cooperating fully with outside agencies that may choose to investigate as well. Officer Martinez has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of our investigation." But the chief's measured response did little to calm the growing storm of criticism. Veterans groups were calling for Martinez's immediate termination and criminal prosecution. Civil rights organizations were demanding federal oversight of the police department. And social media was amplifying the story to millions of people who were sharing the video and expressing their outrage. Back at the hospital, Harry was watching the news coverage with mixed emotions. He was grateful for the support he was receiving from the veteran community and his neighbors, but he was also concerned about the broader implications of the incident. "Dad, the whole country is talking about what happened to you," Sarah said as she sat beside his bed. "Your story is inspiring a lot of people to speak out about police misconduct." Harry nodded thoughtfully. "I never wanted to be the center of this kind of attention, but if what happened to me can help prevent it from happening to someone else, then maybe some good can come from it." Dr. Gonzalez returned with Harry's latest test results. "Your heart rhythm has stabilized somewhat, but you're still showing signs of stress-related cardiac issues. I'd like to keep you here for another day, just to be safe." Harry agreed to stay, though he was eager to get back home and check on Mrs. Chun. He was worried that the media attention might be overwhelming for her, and he wanted to make sure she felt supported during what was undoubtedly a difficult time. As the evening progressed, more details about Officer Martinez began to emerge. Records showed that he had received several citizen complaints over the past 2 years, though none had resulted in disciplinary action. Fellow officers spoke anonymously about his increasingly aggressive behavior and his tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. The police union issued a statement defending Martinez and claiming that he had acted appropriately given the circumstances. But the statement was met with immediate criticism from community leaders who had seen the video footage and knew that there was no justification for tossing an elderly, cooperative citizen. Sarah Richardson spent the evening consulting with colleagues about the best legal strategy for holding the police department accountable. She knew that her father would ultimately recover from his physical injuries, but the principle at stake was much larger than one incident. This was about whether citizens could trust law enforcement to treat them with dignity and respect, regardless of their age, race, or background. As Harry drifted off to sleep in his hospital bed, connected to monitors that tracked every beat of his stressed heart, he had no way of knowing that his story was about to take another dramatic turn. In less than 6 hours, a group of visitors would arrive at the hospital who would change everything about how the incident was perceived by the public and the media. The Marine Corps had not forgotten Harold Richardson, and they were about to make sure that everyone else remembered why attacking one of their own was never a good idea. The few, the proud, the Marines were coming to Mesa General Hospital, and they were not happy about how one of their brothers had been treated. At exactly 05:45 hours the next morning, a convoy of vehicles began arriving in the parking lot of Mesa General Hospital. The first to arrive was a pristine 1987 Chevrolet Silverado flying a Marine Corps flag, followed by a series of motorcycles ridden by men and women wearing Marine Corps Leatherneck Association jackets. Behind them came SUVs, pickup trucks, and sedans, all carrying Marines who had driven through the night from across Arizona, California, and New Mexico. The word had spread through the tight-knit Marine Corps community with the speed and efficiency of a military operation. Harry Richardson, Gunnery Sergeant USMC, retired, had been attacked while serving his community, and Marines from across the Southwest were converging on Mesa to show their support for one of their own. Leading the group was Master Sergeant James Bull Murphy, a barrel-chested man in his 50s who had served under Harry during the Gulf War. Murphy had received the phone call about Harry's situation from a fellow Marine in Phoenix, and within 2 hours he had organized a response that would have made any commanding officer proud. "Listen up," Murphy told the assembled Marines in the hospital parking lot. "Gunny Richardson served with honor for 28 years, and yesterday some jackass cop with a badge thought he could disrespect one of our own. We're here to show Gunny that the Corps hasn't forgotten him, and we're here to show this community what happens when you mess with a Marine." The group that had assembled was impressive in both its size and its diversity. There were Marines from every conflict since Vietnam, ranging in age from their early 20s to their late 70s. Some were still on active duty and had driven through the night after getting permission from their commanding officers to attend. Others were retirees who had dropped everything to support a fellow Marine in need. Among them was Colonel Patricia Henderson, retired, who had been one of the first women to serve in Marine Corps combat roles. She had heard about Harry's situation through veteran networks and had flown in from San Diego specifically to show her support. "Gunny Richardson opened doors for a lot of us," Colonel Henderson told a reporter who was covering the Marine gathering. "He was one of the Marines who proved that leadership isn't about rank or politics. It's about character and service. What happened to him is an attack on everything the Marine Corps stands for." The Marines entered the hospital in formation, their bearing and discipline immediately apparent to everyone in the building. They were not there to cause trouble or create a disturbance. They were there to honor a fellow Marine and to send a clear message that attacks on veterans would not be tolerated. Hospital staff initially tried to limit the number of visitors who could see Harry, but the Marines had anticipated this obstacle. Colonel Henderson presented the hospital administrator with a carefully prepared letter explaining that this was an official visit from the Marine Corps Leatherneck Association to honor a wounded veteran. "Mr. Richardson has served his country with distinction for nearly 3 decades, Colonel Henderson explained to the administrator. "Yesterday, he was attacked while trying to help a neighbor, and he's now recovering from injuries that were inflicted by someone who was supposed to protect him. We're here to show him that his service and sacrifice haven't been forgotten." The hospital administrator, who was himself a Navy veteran, understood the significance of what was happening. He arranged for the Marines to meet in the hospital's main conference room, where they could visit with Harry in small groups without disrupting normal hospital operations. Harry had been awake since 0500, his military training making it impossible for him to sleep past his normal wake-up time, even while recovering from his ordeal. When Sarah arrived with coffee and told him about the Marines gathering in the parking lot, Harry's eyes filled with tears for the first time since the incident. "They didn't need to do this," Harry said quietly. "They've got their own lives and their own families to worry about." Sarah smiled as she looked out the window at the growing crowd of Marines, veterans, and supporters in the parking lot. "Dad, you spent 28 years taking care of other Marines. Now they're taking care of you." The first group to visit Harry included Master Sergeant Murphy and 3 other Marines who had served with him during his final deployment. The reunion was emotional as these battle-tested warriors embraced their former leader, but it was also respectful of Harry's condition and the hospital environment. "Gunny, the whole Marine Corps is talking about what happened to you," Murphy said as he sat beside Harry's bed. "We've got Marines driving here from Camp Pendleton, 29 Palms, and Yuma. Some of the guys flew in from North Carolina and Virginia. We're not going to let this slide." Harry was moved by the support, but he was also concerned about the implications of such a large military presence in response to a civilian police matter. "Bull, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I don't want this to become something that causes problems for the Corps." Murphy grinned. the same expression Harry remembered from their days in the desert. "Gunny, we're not here as active duty Marines. We're here as citizens and veterans who are exercising our right to support a fellow American who was wronged by someone in authority. Everything we're doing is completely legal and within regulations." As word spread about the Marine gathering, other veteran organizations began arriving at the hospital. The Veterans of Foreign Wars, American Legion, and local chapter of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America all sent representatives to show their support for Harry and to express their outrage over his treatment. The media attention was intense, with news crews from local and national outlets covering the unprecedented show of support for a police brutality victim. The image of dozens of Marines standing at attention outside a hospital was powerful symbolism that resonated with viewers across the country. Chief Hayes watched the news coverage from his office with growing alarm. The department was already facing intense scrutiny over the incident, and the arrival of military veterans was adding a new dimension to the crisis. The optics were terrible. On one side was a decorated Marine veteran lying in a hospital bed, and on the other side was a police officer who had used excessive force against an elderly citizen. The mayor's office was fielding calls from veteran advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and members of Congress who were demanding accountability for Martinez's actions. The FBI had announced that they would be conducting their own investigation to determine if Harry's civil rights had been violated under federal law. Officer Martinez was watching the coverage from his home, where he had been ordered to remain during the investigation. The lawyer provided by the police union had advised him not to speak with the media, but Martinez was beginning to understand that his career in law enforcement was effectively over regardless of the outcome of any formal proceedings. Back at the hospital, the visits continued throughout the morning as small groups of Marines took turns meeting with Harry and expressing their support. Each group brought stories about how Harry's leadership had affected their lives and careers, and many shared their own experiences with law enforcement that had been far more positive than what had happened to their former commander. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had served under Harry during her first deployment and credited him with teaching her the leadership skills that had enabled her to become a successful businesswoman after leaving the military. Gunny Richardson taught us that leadership means taking care of your people and standing up for what's right, she told reporters. Yesterday, he was standing up for his neighbor, and he was brutalized for it. That's not the America that Marines fight to defend. The hospital staff was amazed by the discipline and courtesy shown by the Marines throughout their visit. Despite their obvious anger over Harry's treatment, they were polite to hospital employees, respectful of other patients, and careful not to disrupt normal hospital operations. Dr. Gonzalez had been monitoring Harry's condition closely, and she was pleased to see that the visits from his fellow Marines were actually having a positive effect on his recovery. His heart rhythm had stabilized further, and his blood pressure had improved significantly since the morning. "Mr. Richardson, I think your Marine family is better medicine than anything I can prescribe," Dr. Gonzalez told Harry after reviewing his latest test results. "If you continue to improve at this rate, we should be able to discharge you tomorrow morning." As the day progressed, the gathering outside the hospital grew to include hundreds of veterans and civilian supporters. Local businesses began providing food and water for the crowd, and several organizations set up information booths to register voters and provide resources for veterans dealing with their own issues with law enforcement. The peaceful nature of the demonstration was remarkable given the level of anger that many participants felt about Harry's treatment. The Marines maintained order and discipline throughout the event, and there were no incidents of confrontation or disorder despite the intense emotions involved. Colonel Henderson held a press conference in the hospital parking lot, surrounded by Marines representing every branch of service and every major conflict of the past 50 years. Her words were measured but firm as she addressed the cameras and the growing crowd. "We are here today to honor Gunnery Sergeant Harry Richardson, a Marine who has served his country with distinction for 28 years and who has continued to serve his community as a volunteer and neighbor," Colonel Henderson said. Yesterday, while trying to help a neighbor who had been the victim of a crime, Gunny Richardson was assaulted by a police officer who used a weapon against an elderly, cooperative citizen. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in before continuing. We are not here to condemn all law enforcement officers. Many of us have worked closely with police officers, sheriff's deputies, and federal agents throughout our careers, and we know that the vast majority of them are honorable people who serve their communities with integrity. But when any law enforcement officer abuses their authority and attacks a citizen who is trying to help, that officer must be held accountable. The Colonel's statement was broadcast live on multiple networks and was immediately shared across social media platforms. Within hours, it had been viewed by millions of people, and hashtag Justice for Gunny Richardson was trending on multiple social media platforms. Inside the hospital, Harry was watching the press conference on television with a mixture of pride and concern. He was deeply moved by the support he was receiving from his fellow Marines, but he was also worried about the broader implications of the incident for relations between the military and civilian law enforcement. "Dad, this is bigger than just what happened to you," Sarah said as she watched the coverage. "This is about accountability and justice and making sure that people in positions of authority can't abuse their power without consequences." Harry nodded, understanding that his personal ordeal had become a symbol of larger issues in American society. The video of his tossing had struck a nerve with people who were frustrated with police misconduct and the lack of accountability for officers who abuse their authority. As evening approached, the Marines began organizing a formal ceremony to honor Harry and to conclude their day of support. They arranged themselves in formation in the hospital parking lot, with flags from all branches of military service displayed prominently at the front of the group. The ceremony began with the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by a moment of silence for fallen Marines and all veterans who had been mistreated by those in authority. Master Sergeant Murphy then read a proclamation on behalf of the assembled Marines, declaring their continued support for Harry and their commitment to seeing justice done in his case. The ceremony concluded with the Marines singing the Marine Corps hymn, their voices carrying across the parking lot and into the surrounding neighborhood. It was a powerful moment that brought tears to the eyes of many observers, including hospital staff members who had been watching from windows throughout the building. As the Marines began to disperse, many of them approached news crews to share their final thoughts about the day's events. Their message was consistent. Marines take care of their own, and attacks on veterans would not be tolerated or forgotten. The day had been a remarkable demonstration of military brotherhood and civilian support for a wounded veteran. But it had also sent a clear message to law enforcement agencies across the country that the veteran community was watching and that officers who abused their authority would face consequences that went far beyond standard disciplinary procedures. Harry Richardson had become more than just a victim of police brutality. He had become a symbol of the thousands of veterans who had served their country with honor only to be mistreated by the very institutions they had sworn to protect. And the Marines who had gathered in his honor had made it clear that they would not allow such treatment to continue without fighting back. 3 months later, Harry Richardson stood in a packed federal courthouse in Phoenix, his hand raised as he was sworn in to testify before a federal grand jury investigating civil rights violations in the Mesa Police Department. The events that had begun with a simple attempt to help a neighbor had grown into a comprehensive examination of police misconduct that extended far beyond his own case. The FBI investigation had uncovered a pattern of excessive force and discriminatory practices within the Mesa Police Department that dated back several years. Officer Martinez's attack on Harry had been the final incident that prompted federal intervention, but investigators discovered that it was part of a broader culture of aggression and lack of accountability that had affected dozens of citizens. Harry's medical recovery had been complete, though the psychological impact of the incident had taken longer to heal. The support he had received from the Marine Corps and the broader veteran community had been instrumental in helping him process the trauma of being attacked by someone who was supposed to protect him. Sarah Richardson had filed a comprehensive civil rights lawsuit against Officer Martinez, the Mesa Police Department, and the city of Mesa. The case had been settled out of court for a substantial sum, but more importantly, it had resulted in significant reforms in police training, oversight, and accountability measures. Officer Martinez had been terminated from the police department and had been criminally charged with aggravated assault and civil rights violations. He ultimately pleaded guilty to federal charges and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, along with 5 years of supervised probation. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked, ensuring that he would never again have the authority to carry a badge and weapon. The other officers who had been present during the incident had received various disciplinary measures, though none as severe as Martinez. Officer Johnson and Officer Williams had been commended for their cooperation with the investigation and their willingness to testify truthfully about what they had witnessed. Chief Hayes had retired early rather than face potential termination for his department's failures. The city had hired a new police chief with extensive experience in community policing and police reform and had implemented comprehensive changes to training, policy, and oversight procedures. The broader impact of Harry's case had been felt throughout law enforcement communities across the country. The image of Marines gathering to support a brutalized veteran had become a powerful symbol of the consequences that could result when police officers abused their authority. Training academies began using the incident as a case study in how poor judgment and excessive force could destroy careers and damage community trust. Mrs. Chin's burglary case had been solved within a week of the incident, though it had been overshadowed by the larger story of Harry's treatment. The suspects had been caught trying to sell the stolen tools at a pawn shop, and they were eventually convicted and sentenced to prison terms. Mrs. Chun had become a powerful advocate for police reform and had testified before the city council about the discriminatory treatment she had experienced. On the day of Harry's testimony before the federal grand jury, the courthouse was surrounded by supporters, including many of the same Marines who had gathered at the hospital months earlier. The veteran community had remained engaged throughout the legal process, ensuring that Harry's case received the attention and support it deserved. Master Sergeant Murphy had retired from Marine Corps and had taken a job with a veteran advocacy organization partly inspired by his involvement in Harry's case. What happened to Gunny Richardson showed us that we can't just thank veterans for their service and then ignore them when they need our help, Murphy explained to reporters outside the courthouse. We have a responsibility to make sure that people who serve their country are treated with the respect and dignity they've earned. The federal investigation had resulted in a consent decree requiring the Mesa Police Department to operate under federal oversight for at least 5 years. The agreement mandated comprehensive reforms, including new training programs, improved hiring standards, enhanced accountability measures, and regular monitoring by federal officials. Harry's testimony to the grand jury was clear and detailed as he described the events of that October morning and the impact they had had on his life and his community. He spoke about the fear that now existed among elderly residents and minority communities who worried that they might be subjected to similar treatment if they encountered law enforcement. But Harry also spoke about the positive changes that had resulted from the incident. The new police chief had instituted community policing programs that emphasized building relationships between officers and the neighborhoods they served. Training programs now included extensive instruction on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and the special considerations required when dealing with elderly citizens and people with medical conditions. I don't want what happened to me to define how people think about law enforcement, Harry told the grand jury. Most police officers are good people who want to serve their communities honestly. But when officers abuse their authority, they need to be held accountable, and departments need to be reformed to prevent similar incidents from happening again. The grand jury ultimately returned indictments against 3 additional officers for civil rights violations in separate cases that had been uncovered during the investigation of Harry's incident. The federal prosecution sent a clear message that law enforcement officers who violated citizens' rights would face serious consequences under federal law. 6 months after his testimony, Harry was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for a new class of police recruits in Mesa. The invitation came from a new police chief who wanted the recruits to understand the human impact of police misconduct and the importance of treating every citizen with dignity and respect. Harry's speech to the graduating officers was thoughtful and balanced. He spoke about his respect for law enforcement and his understanding of the difficult decisions that officers faced every day. But he also challenged them to be the kind of officers who would earn the trust and respect of their communities through their actions rather than demanding it because of their authority. Every time you put on that uniform and badge, you represent every other police officer in the country, Harry told the recruits. Your actions reflect not just on yourselves, but on every man and woman who has chosen to serve in law enforcement. You have the power to build trust or destroy it, to protect citizens or harm them, to serve your community or serve only yourselves. The speech received a standing ovation from the recruits, their families, and the community members who attended the ceremony. Several of the new officers approached Harry afterward to thank him for his service and to assure him that they would strive to be the kind of officers who would make their communities proud. Mrs. Chun had also been invited to speak at the graduation ceremony, and she shared her perspective as an immigrant who had initially been afraid to call police for help, but who now felt more confident that she would be treated fairly and with respect. Mr. Richardson was trying to help me when he was hurt, she told the graduating officers. But even after what happened to him, he still believes that most police officers are good people who want to help their communities. I hope you will prove him right. The changes in Mesa had become a model for police reform efforts in other communities across the country. The combination of federal oversight, community engagement, and comprehensive policy changes had resulted in significant improvements in police-community relations and a dramatic reduction in complaints about excessive force and discriminatory treatment. Harry had resumed his normal routine of volunteering at the food bank and helping neighbors with various projects, though he remained more cautious in his interactions with law enforcement. The incident had changed him in ways that were both subtle and profound, but it had not diminished his commitment to serving his community or his faith in the possibility of positive change. On the first anniversary of the incident, Harry and Mrs. Chun organized a neighborhood barbecue that brought together residents, police officers from the Reform Department, and many of the veterans who had supported Harry throughout his ordeal. The event was both a celebration of community resilience and a reminder of the work that remained to be done to ensure that all citizens were treated fairly by those in authority. Officer Johnson, who had been promoted to sergeant and had become a community policing specialist, attended the barbecue with his family. He approached Harry to express his continued regret about what had happened and to thank him for his grace in dealing with the aftermath. Mr. Richardson, I want you to know that what happened that day changed how I approach my job, Sergeant Johnson said. I think about you every time I respond to a call, and I ask myself whether I'm serving the community the way you would want to be served. Harry shook the officer's hand warmly. That's all any of us can ask for, Sergeant. We all make mistakes, but it's how we learn from them and grow that defines who we are. The conversation between Harry and Sergeant Johnson was witnessed by several of the neighborhood children who had come to know Harry as the friendly grandfather who always had time to help with homework or teach them about gardening. For these children, Harry's example had shown them that standing up for what's right was more important than avoiding conflict, and that even when people are wronged, they can choose to respond with dignity and a commitment to positive change rather than with anger and revenge. As the barbecue continued into the evening, with Marines, police officers, neighbors, and community leaders sharing food and conversation, it was clear that Harry's ordeal had created something valuable from a traumatic experience. The incident had forced a community to confront uncomfortable truths about authority, accountability, and justice, but it had also demonstrated the power of people coming together to demand better from their institutions and from themselves. Harry Richardson had never wanted to be a symbol or a spokesperson for police reform. He had simply wanted to help a neighbor who had been the victim of a crime. But When he was attacked for that simple act of kindness, he had responded not with bitterness or calls for revenge, but with a commitment to ensuring that others would not face similar treatment. His example had inspired reforms that would protect countless other citizens from abuse, and his grace in the face of injustice had shown that it was possible to demand accountability while still believing in the possibility of positive change. The Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, means always faithful, and Harry Richardson had remained faithful to his values of service, integrity, and commitment to others even when those values were tested by his own government's representatives. In the end, his faithfulness had been rewarded not just with justice for himself, but with meaningful reforms that would benefit his entire community for years to come. The story of a 72-year-old ex-military grandfather who was tossed pointlessly had become the story of a community that chose to respond to injustice with demands for accountability and positive change. And 6 minutes after the Marines showed up, everyone involved knew that Harry Richardson's service to his country and his community would be remembered and honored long after the incident that had brought them all together was forgotten.